So now the time has finally come, and we are at a stage where we are ready to export our game. It may not be finished, but we have gone through many of the steps required to building the visual novel. And when it comes time to exporting your game, you're going to want to make sure that you optimize it to the best of your ability for the platform that you are targeting. So such as for mobile devices, you want to really focus on optimizing your textures and your memory usage. And we've been doing a little bit of that as we've gone through this series, but before you get ready to export, just make sure that if you haven't already imported your textures in such a way, make sure that you import them with the proper resolutions and compression if need be. And this is especially true with audio. So for our music, we definitely want to make sure that we are using the lower quality rather than 100, because you can't really tell a difference in the audio sound, at least I can't. And it does save a lot of space. It makes loading things quicker, snappier, so you want to make sure you go through your resources and compress things to not only limit how much memory is going to be used in the game, but also how much space is going to be used on the device, because space is a very precious asset. But let's say that you've got all of that taken care of, and you are just ready to go ahead and take this content and export it out to an application. Well, Unity makes that real easy. You can come into File, and there's a section called Build Settings. Build Settings has everything we need to export our game to the target platform. And if there's other things you want to customize, such as the version and some different settings, you have player settings down here. If you click player settings, you can change your company name, the product, and of course the version, as well as any other sort of settings here that you may want to change for your game. So one thing I've done is changed my company name to Stellar Studio, the product to the game, which is Interstella, and version 1.0, as well as setting the default icon for the application. Additionally, the icon that I have assigned for Windows, Mac, and Linux to make sure that that is what I want for those platforms, you can assign whatever sort of sprite you would want in that instance. So I've chosen the Stellar Studio icon, and that will show up in the application when it actually installs. I'm not going to go through all of the settings here, but be aware that there are many things you can tweak here for your individual use case, and just for your visual novel in general. So maybe you would want yours to run in the background, which means if it's not actively selected, it's not the active application in the screen that the player's clicked on, if they've clicked out of something, if it's not set to run in the background, it's going to pause, the music's going to stop, and everything is just going to freeze. Now that is especially important for mobile. You definitely don't want something like that running in the background. For desktop, depending on the game, we may want that running in the background. But as for the visual novel, I don't see where that should really be the case. So I'm going to leave that unchecked, but be aware that is an option. Really, these are all the changes I'm going to make, and I'm going to exit out of this, but what we really want to make sure is we have any scene that we want to include in the build that should be used in the game, it should be showing up in these scenes in build. If it's not, well, it's not going to be in the application. So we already have the visual novel here, and we've got the sample scene. So the sample scene doesn't need to be here, so if I right-click that, I can remove it, and all we have is the visual novel scene. Now, since I have the main menu open, I can click this button, Add Open Scenes, and it'll go ahead and add the main menu in. So the main menu is going to be included in the build. And I'll just drag that up above, and that is the first scene in the list, followed by the visual novel, which it loads. You want to make sure that the starting scene is at the top of the list and at index 0, because this is going to be the scene that loads at the very start of the game. Whenever someone launches the application, it's going to load scene 0. And from there, you can load whatever you need. Our main menu is automatically going to load the visual novel, so this is perfect. Now, if you don't have visual novel in here, which I think you should, what we can do is we can manually add it. So if I were to go and find this, let's say I have, where did I put my scenes at? I'm inside of main. If I look under scenes here, then we have main menu visual novel, so you can just literally drag in a scene file, and if visual novel wasn't there, then now it will be added to the list. So just add everything that you want to be included in the application. Additionally, Unity comes with the ability to export to different platforms. So exporting to Windows, Mac, and Linux is my default, and that's available to me right off the bat. But say I wanted to export to Android or iOS. We can see that these are grayed out. And all we have to do is choose the option to install with Unity Hub. And if we click that, it's going to open up the hub and it's going to allow us to add the different platforms that we want support for. So we'll just install that to our system and then we will be good to go to export to that platform. But when we're first exporting, we may want to keep development build checked. This will allow us to have a debugger on the screen while the game is running. So if it encounters errors, it'll go ahead and show the message and we can debug our game. So as we're starting this is something that I would leave checked just to make sure everything's in place and everything's good and running fine. And then once you figure out it's fine, you can re-export and uncheck development build. But I'm going to leave that on for right now. Okay, so if we were to go ahead and try to build and run, there are a couple other things that we're going to need to change to make it where we can export, but let's just go ahead and try. I'm going to go ahead and create a new folder called Interstella. And this is where I'm going to export the game to. So I will select that folder, and as simple as that, it's going to start building all of the assets and compiling everything. But as you can see, something happened. Inside of the console, I have an error and the build did not complete successfully. So build completed because it was a failure while it was trying to compile some of these scripts. And this is due in part to Visual Studio adding a bunch of namespaces that I didn't need, and I didn't catch all of that. So apparently our gallery database extension has a namespace called GraphView, which is part of the Unity editor. So anything Unity editor is not going to be available when you export, only Unity engine. Unity editor is only for when we're obviously working in the editor, so if we have any namespaces like that in our main scripts, we need to make sure that those are gone or they are encapsulated within a condition where they are only compiled if we're using the Unity editor. So let's go ahead and double click that and I'll show you what I'm talking about. So here we are in the command database extension gallery script. This has a bunch of namespaces that I'm not actually using, and this was Visual Studio just adding them as I was typing, and I really can just get rid of some of these. If you see a namespace that's in gray, or grayer text, darker text, that means it's not being used. So anything down below is not going to be effective if we decide to get rid of this. And in this case, we have a Unity editor namespace, and that's preventing our application from exporting. So let's go ahead and remove all of these unneeded namespaces and resave. And I would go through the rest of these scripts and make sure there's nothing unneeded in there as well, such as if I look at my audio manager in the inspector, this is the best way to quickly check the namespaces and see if anything doesn't belong. So the audio manager, I can see that Visual Studio automatically added a couple things that have nothing to do with audio at all. We have Unity Engine rendering and visual scripting, so I know I can get rid of that. And if I open that up, we can see that those two are grayed out, so they are not needed at all. And neither is system.collections, so I could remove that from this script as well. And the only thing you'd really want to do is just look at each of your scripts and make sure they don't have any namespaces that really don't belong in there. So I would go through and look through all of these and just check if there's anything that doesn't belong. So go through any of your scripts and make sure you don't have any editor namespaces in there, or, as I'll show you here in a second, and make sure it's just encapsulated if it's needed for the editor. So if we go into the testing folder, we could actually go ahead and delete this whole testing folder because we no longer need it. But before I do that, I'm going to go ahead and come into the scripts and just show what we can do. So first of all, if you do have any editor scripts, such as I have this sprite loader editor, and of course that is using editor namespaces, it's not going to give us any errors when we export the game because it is in an editor folder. So if you have a folder called editor, that's not going to be compiled into the game. So just make sure that if you have editor scripts, that they are in the editor folder. Now for the other scripts, these testing scripts, while they're not going to stop our game from being built, They are unnecessary, and we don't need the space in the game. Granted, these are small text files, but we don't need to add that into the game engine and the exported game size when they're not even used outside of testing purposes. So you could go ahead and delete all of this, or you could come in and encapsulate it all so it's only compiled if we are in the editor. And we can do that by coming up the top, doing a hashtag, and say if Unity editor. So everything between if Unity editor and end if is only going to be compiled if we are in the Unity editor. So I'll just take that end if and take it all the way down to the bottom of the script and save. So that way this whole testing script, I can still use it in the editor, but it will not be exported into the actual build. If you want to preserve any of your scripts, then go ahead and do it this way. Otherwise, feel free to delete those testing scripts as we don't need them anymore. So we could go ahead and build and run one more time. So I'm going to try Interstellar, select the folder, and build the game. If you encounter any other errors, just look in the console and see what's causing them, and then go ahead and fix it. But without me skipping any other video, I've made no other changes, and I'm able to export here, provided that Norton actually allows me to run the application. So I'll go ahead and allow this instance. And looks like the build has completed successfully. So here we are, Interstellar is running. But as you can see, since I made it development mode, we can see that the console has detected an issue. And this is coming from our save and load menu, where getPersistentDataPath is not allowed to be called from a MonoBehavior constructor or instance field initializer. Call it in awake or start instead. It was called by save and load menu, and that's where we are getting a save directory, it looks like. So I'll go ahead and close that and exit out of this and see what's up with that. So apparently that's happening right here inside of the save and load menu with a variable that, as you can see by the gray, I'm not even using. I think I put it here because I was initially going to use it, but decided to run that through the save files instead. Now the problem with why this isn't working is because of how it's being populated. This is an initialized variable because we're initializing it in the declaration. And Unity does not like you to use persistent data when you're doing an initialized variable. So where are we getting that persistent data path from? It's coming from file paths in game saves, which if we look at that, it's getting runtime path. And runtime path is finding application.persistentDataPath because we have exported and we're running it outside of the Unity editor. So Unity does not like us getting this value inside of an initialization function. If we get it anytime outside of initialization, it's fine. But if we try to assign it as I'm doing here, it's just going to error out and cause an issue. So being that I'm not even using this line, I'll go ahead and just remove it. And now everything seems to be working. We did not get that error on startup, so we just need to confirm that this application is having no issues. So everything looks fine. This is where we'd come through and do a play test and just make sure everything works. So we can see the gallery has nothing because I've not actually played anything. Our full screen options, looks like all that's working. Yeah, so everything's looking good. Let's go ahead and start the game and let's try to save and load and make sure that the file input-output is working. So I can come through, save, and if I try to save, I get an issue, directory not found. Could not find part of the path where we are saving the preview image. Now, if I were to come to the file data, which if we're using persistent data path, then that's going to be in your user's app data, local low, followed by whatever your default company is, in which case I changed mine to Stellar Studio in the player settings, so that's where I'm at. This is a Windows path, not sure about Mac or Linux how that would be, but we can easily do a Google search and see where that would be. But here on Windows, I can see Interstellar right here. And app data is the folder that my visual novel created to store the application data. Inside of here, we can see game data and vnconfig.cfg. So we can see that yes, the file input-output is working, but something in particular prevented the save file from being written to. Since we have this VN configuration file, we know it can't be a permission issue, so it's got to be something in the code. If we come to the VN game save script, this is where it's happening, because when we come down to save, our file manager is automatically going to try to create a folder if it doesn't exist. So when we go to save the save file, that's going to work, because it'll see that the directory doesn't exist and it's going to work. But there is something that's trying to be saved before we actually write this file, and that is our screenshot. You'll notice that error told me that it couldn't save the screenshot because the first save file has not been made, which means that directory which holds the save files has not been created yet. So we could either do that on start as like an initialization for the app or part of the install process, or we could go through and make sure our screenshot master forces the directory to be created if it's going to take a screenshot in a new directory. So we could do that, or it would literally be as easy of a fix as we take this and put it after we save the file. So that way it's definitely going to be applied inside of the directory that already exists. But I'm going to leave it right there, and I'm going to make sure it creates the directory if it's not there already. So when I come to capture the screenshot, save screenshot to file is right here. Now system.io.file.write all bytes, and this is where it's having the issue. It's trying to write it to a directory that doesn't exist. So I can go ahead and say directory dot create directory, or we have the file or the function in our file manager. We'd say file manager dot try create directory from path, file path, and that'll go ahead and create it for us. So the note to make on that is anywhere you're going to be saving a file, you need to make sure that the directory exists first. Otherwise, you will be running into an issue. The same with trying to load a file. You need to make sure that the path always exists before you try any sort of input-output to the file system. And now, after exporting one more time, I can go ahead and choose to save, and it'll go ahead and save correctly. I'll go ahead and move on to where we get characters on screen. Now I'll go ahead and save this file. Save it, and there we go. I'll go ahead and quit the application, and then relaunch it. Only this time, if I look at the app data, now we can see we have the save files directory, which has both of those save files created. And the app data also has a gallery file, because I've unlocked the first image. So here we go, I'm going to launch my application again. And if I go to load, I have both of those files there. And if I go to the gallery, I've got my first gallery image because I've unlocked it. Let me go ahead and load this back up. And it looks like everything's working just fine.
Yeah.
There we go, there's the second gallery image. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and go back home, look at gallery, and I've got both the images. Go ahead and exit, load it back up, and all the data is persisting because it's written to file.